Sing.
Oh.
Every time I hear Sing Sing, I think of Breakfast at Tiffany's.
Oh, yeah.
He was, and this is interesting. So he got 18 months for larceny.
Mm-hmm.
And then he was released in January of 1919. A year late, like literally almost a year later, on January 22nd, 1920, he was sent back to Sing Sing for 30 months for attempted burglary. For actual burglary, he got 18 months. And then for attempted burglary, he got 30 months, which makes no fucking sense.
How come murder doesn't work that way? Attempted murder? Don't get much time. I'm like, they still had the same intention, though.
No. For actual burglary, he got less time than for attempted. He got 18 months for actually burglaring and then 30 months for trying to burgle.
Well, what I'm saying is when you like intend to murder someone but you don't actually succeed, you get a lot less time. You should get the same. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you should get the fucking same. Because what, you get less time because you're a piece of shit and you failed to murder them because you're bad at what you do?
True.
Clearly, I gave myself more beer than Sarah. So he was released March 16th, 1920. I should just sing the rest of this. He was released March 1922. After this... No, I'm not going to sing, sorry. After this release, he began working with childhood friend Jacob Gura Shapiro. Now, if you remember from the Abe episode, or if you haven't listened, I talked about Abe Kid Twist, who was another mob person. And when he first started his mob career, he worked for the Shapiro brothers. Mm-hmm. And those are the brothers who would end up kidnapping his girlfriend. This Jacob Shapiro, no relation, even though it's the same last name. So I just want to... So the name sounds familiar, but it's not he's not related to the three brothers.
Okay.
So Lepke and Jacob Shapiro took... This is kind of funny, but it'll make more sense. And I had to look into this, but because one article just said they took control of the garment industry unions.
Okay.
And I was like, what?
How?
So with force and intimidation, they basically like threatened and they took over the unions. And I was like, why do they need clothes? But this makes sense. So Lepke basically paid people off and used threats and whatever, and kind of like, he wasn't running a union, but he like essentially, quote, owned the people in the union. And he did this so he could... He used the unions to threaten strikes. So basically, like, he paid off the people or threatened them so they would do whatever he said, and then he would make them threaten strikes. And then doing so allowed him to demand weekly payments from the factory owners. So he took control of all the people in the unions at all the garment maker factories, and then would tell them, like, oh, you guys are going to go on strike. And then he'd go to the factory worker and be like... Yeah, they'll stop striking if you fucking pay me every week.
That's pretty clever, actually. Sometimes I'm like, that makes no sense. I'm like, well, that's why I'm not a big mafia boss. I'm like, I wouldn't have thought of that.
This is why we have day jobs. My butt is falling asleep.
Wake her up.
Why don't you just do my butt's a her?
I mean, I think that's valid, but true.
The union control, so this whole scheme he was doing, evolved into an air quotes protection racket, which I had to look up that term separately. It's an old like term, and it's
just a term. It's fine.
But I looked it up instead of my usual like I don't fucking know. So I looked up the protection racket, which then I was like, duh. It's basically the scheme where a group, which would be the two men and friends. Well, so essentially they were like they became what would later become Murder Inc. More than Inc. So the protection racket is essentially where you're like, hey, Joe, you want me to protect you and be like your bouncer, and if people mess with you, I'll fuck them up? You pay me. So like that's what they were doing. Like that's a protection racket, air quotes. They were like, we'll protect you and we will fuck up people and break their ankles if they mess with you and you'll pay us. That's the whole like protection scheme that they started.
Okay.
So they offered their services. And I wrote, they are basically like bouncers who are super violent.
That's terrifying because I already think bouncers are violent. So, yes.
Even when Lepke became a top organized crime boss, which I'll get into in a minute, he always kept control of the unions. Like this was always, he kept doing this like for his whole career, air quotes. Lepke made a shit ton of money doing both of these jobs, in air quotes. He moved into a luxury building in New York and then eventually moved his family into a penthouse in Central Park West, Manhattan, which I read is a very exclusive neighborhood.
See, I told you it was good to be his friend.
In 1927, the crime and violence started to catch up to them. Lepke and Jacob were both arrested for the murder of Jacob Little Augie Organ.
Oh.
And attempted murder of Gentleman Jack Diamond. They were both bootleggers and gangsters, and they were rivals of our two friends, and that's why they killed one and tried to kill the other, just because they were rivals in the business. But in true organized crime of this time, the charges were dropped. You know what I'm trying to say? Like, it's fucking early 1900s.
That's just how it worked. If someone's like, oh, these guys are mafia guys, you're like, well, you guys can run away scot-free.
Yeah, they're probably paying off cops, whatever. So the charges get dropped, and they're like, great, peace, see you later.
Yeah.
Peace out, Cub Scout. On August 20th, 1931, Lepke marries Betty Wasserman, a British widow, and he adopts her child from a previous marriage. And then it is about that time where they start the infamous Murder Inc. that we've talked about. All started by Lepke, and then you'll remember Albert the Mad Hatter Anastasia, who I talked about in the mob episode. So it was during the early 1930s that Lepke created what he saw as an effective way of performing contract killings for mobsters, what the press would dub Murder Inc. That's essentially what Murder Inc. was. It was an effective, efficient way of linking up people who wanted someone dead with a killer. So Albert the Mad Hatter would, and this is how it worked, Albert the Mad Hatter would get the contract requests. Like, people would reach out to him and be like, yo, Tony, I want Sarah to die.
Shit.
But no one was named Sarah back then.
I mean.
And then the Mad Hatter would be like, yo, Lepke, so-and-so wants Tony to die. And so Lepke's job in this whole scheme was to assign the killing to a Jewish and or Italian, because there was like the mafia and the mob. Like, everyone's kind of separate, like the Irish, whatever. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
So Lepke would assign the killing to a Jewish and or Italian street gang member, mainly in Brooklyn. Part of his job was to make sure that none of the killers he was choosing, so none of the hitmen that he was choosing, were allowed to have any connections to major crime families. And he would threaten them to make sure, like, they had to know that if they got caught, they could not rat anyone out involved. So, like, his job was essentially to very selectively choose hitmen who weren't related and would not rat them out. Lepke would also hire them for murders he wanted carried out. Murder Inc.
So he was using his employees for personal errands.
What a dick.
Sounds like the mafia.
Personal errands. Murder Inc. soon was carrying out contract killings all over the country. So, and this is what I didn't run into when I was doing the Abe case. Like, they were fucking all over.
I would assume they were just in New York, but okay.
Yeah, they were not. They were all the fuck everywhere.
That's terrifying.
He also worked with Lucky Louis Luciano, who I talked about, to establish the National Crime Syndicate. Well, and I feel like I talked about it in my last episode, but the National Crime Syndicate, which is a website I've gone to a couple times, was actually the name given to the, and this was how it was described in the article, the, quote, loosely connected American confederation of several crime organizations, mostly Irish, Italian, and Jewish. So essentially the press or whoever was like, oh, all the mob people, we're just going to call them the National Crime Syndicate.
Okay.
That's what they're called. And then, so you have the National Crime Syndicate, which is like the whole connection. And then think of Murder Inc. as their like security or killing, like their little arm of their violence.
Yeah.
So you've got the National Crime Syndicate, which is just all the mob and mafia kind of lumped into one name. And then Murder Inc. was like, oh, that's our little branch over here who kills people. But they're all related. In 1935, Lepke arranged the most significant murder of his career, air quotes. The murder of the powerful and well-known at the time New York gangster Dutch Schultz.
Oh, fancy name.
And this all happened because, so there is a prosecutor who I'm going to talk more about, New York District Attorney Thomas Dewey, and I'll explain more about him, but essentially DA Thomas Dewey was investigating Dutch. So Dutch goes into he approaches the whole like crew, like the main guys of the National Crime Syndicate. I'm going to start calling NCS. So he calls the Brotherhood together and he's like, hey, I would like to order a hit on DA Thomas Dewey. Lucky Luciano, another gangster who's part of the NCS, they're all sitting in this room where Dutch is like, hey, we need to kill the DA. Lucky's like, no way. If we kill the DA, that's going to result in law enforcement like cracking down on crime. Like, we're not going to put a hit out on a DA. Not fucking happening. happening.
I like that you say they like order a hit. Like I think if that happened now, it's like you'd have a mobile app to order. It would be delivered in 2 hours.
Uber Eats.
Uber defeats. I don't know.
Uber defeats. So they have this big meeting. So Dutch storms out of the meeting and is like, I'm going to kill him anyways without your help. So the NCS, it's kind of funny that we know, like, well, we know all this because people came forward later. But so they all stay in the room wherever they're at and they talk for 6 hours. And then they're like, yeah, Dutch has to go. Because they agree that they can't kill the DA. But Dutch, like, stormed out of there all dick-like. And they're like, okay, now we got to kill Dutch. Like, that's what has to happen.
I like that they can't just fire him. Like, he has to die.
Yeah, that's how this works.
Jeez Louise.
So they order his murder through Lepke, our friend. Not, kind of.
Pre-mobile app.
So on October 23rd, 1935. So remember, it's not Lepke who's doing it, but he hires 2 other people. So in October 1935, Dutch is shot and killed in Newark, New Jersey at a bar. Oh. He's shot and then he dies the next day. During this time, Lepke is still working with Murder, Inc. He's still working with Luciano and Mad Hatter. And he is working with old trusty Abe Kid Twist carrying out hits. I don't know if you remember how the Abe thing ended, but we'll talk about it. And I know I mentioned this in the other episode too, but Murder Inc. is ultimately responsible for at least 1,000 murders.
Oh my God.
Ironically, in a twist, Thomas Dewey, that prosecutor who they're like, yeah, we can't kill him. This prosecutor turns all of his attention to Lepke and wants to take him down like he was doing with Dutch. So then Lepke's downfall comes soon. On September 13th, 1936, Lepke orders Murder, Inc. to kill Joseph Rosen. He's a candy store owner. And I talked about his murder in the Abe case. You can remember why, but I'll get to it.
I wonder if that's where the gum was stolen. Oh my God. His candy shop.
Well, what's crazy about this is this story is literally going to end in the same place my Abe case ended. They because they're all happening parallel.
Let me guess. With murder.
Yes. Well, that's why I chose this case because it just aligned interestingly. But it's just essentially another piece in the Abe story.
Yeah.
So but Lepke personally orders the murder of Joseph Rosen, the candy store owner. And it's because Joseph was supposedly, never proven, but he was supposedly working with the DA, Thomas Dewey, telling him like what he knew about all the mob men. So Lepke had some guys go like rough him up and tell him he needs to leave town. And he didn't. So then they were like, all right, you're going to get murdered.
Oh my.
So they shoot him like in broad daylight. No one is arrested right away, but in November of that same year, Lepke and then Shapiro, who I talked about earlier, are arrested for violating antitrust laws. And it had something to do with like trading fur or something like dumb. But it was the only thing Dewey, the DA, could prove. Dewey, the DA.
I know. Huey, Dewey, and Louie.
They were given 2 years each. The police and the DA were still trying to find evidence. So while they're in bars for the 2 years, or I guess it was right after they got out, because Lepke's free at this point, but then he knows he's facing charges for trying to smuggle heroin. And there wasn't a ton of details on that, but we know what smuggling heroin means. You're smuggling heroin.
Very valid point, Caitlin.
So with this charge, like he hasn't been charged or arrested, but he like knows it's coming, and this is super serious jail time. So he disappears before the cops can get him. So a large reward is offered, and it started out like $1,500, but then went to $25,000, which back then was a shit fucking ton of money.
Yeah, geez.
For his whereabouts and then like a giant manhunt ensues in the U.S. and in Europe. Like the FBI is looking for him. Lepke was able to he stayed in hiding for 2 years. But then in August of 1939, he surrendered because there was this popular radio host who, like, quote or air quotes, made a deal with him, like released something on the radio. But it was a deal that was fake or never existed. But he was like, oh, you got to turn yourself in. You're going to get less time. Like, and that's like the rumor or whatever, but not true. But he hears this somehow or thinks there's this deal. So he surrenders to J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, in a supposed deal. Like I said, it's false. There's no deal. And what's really funny about this is police learn he never left New York, which I think is pretty impressive.
Wow. He like led was a big part of this whole like national campaign of crime and was like, well, I'm a homebody.
He never fucking left New York. But that also shows how powerful his connections were.
That's true.
He didn't even leave the city. He just hid in New York for 2 years. And if he didn't think this deal was happening, I don't think he would have come out. After surrendering, he was charged with smuggling heroin, and then he was sentenced to 14 years. Then he was given 30 more for labor racketeering as police got more evidence. So charges, they're finally starting to get more evidence. And this is kind of after organized crime is like, quote unquote, like paying off cops. Like it's more like now that the FBI is involved, like they're starting to give a shit and not let them go. But then in 1941, it gets worse.